Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the British-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce's online discussion on the, let's call it the situation, the ongoing unpredictable situation in Belarus and its ramifications not only for the region, but much broader for Europe and even perhaps beyond in the longer term. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank not just our panelists. I'll introduce them in a second. I'd like to thank the president of the British-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce, Toms, for his idea, for his initiative. Unfortunately, he's in a plane heading to London at this moment, but he will watch this later. Let me just explain also to the audience out there. This will be recorded, so there will be a chance to share this with your friends afterwards. If you have questions, feel free to write short ones and send them to us. And also at the end, we hope we will have time to at least address a few from the audience. Okay, so let me start off by introducing our very distinguished group of specialists. We have Nigel Gould-Davis. He's currently Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. He's the former British ambassador to Belarus, and as many of you have probably noticed, he's been writing extensively on developments in Belarus and in the region. So welcome, Nigel. Andreas Aslund, well known to many of us, eminent economist and author, and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, who has also been writing a lot on this topic in recent weeks. Andreas Umland, German scholar, analyst, currently senior, among other hats he wears, senior expert at the Institute for the Future in Kyiv, also writes very prolifically on this region and is a specialist on Ukraine. I'm Bohdan Nahaylo, born in Britain, a journalist, veteran Ukraine watcher, formerly with the UN for many years, with Radio Liberty, but claim to know a little bit about Ukraine too. So thank you all our specialists for joining us. Let me set the scene then. So even today, these dramatic events in Lukashenko land, as it used to be called, are still ongoing. We had the self-proclamation by him, almost secretly done, as president. Several countries have already reaffirmed that they will not recognize him as the legitimate president, including Germany, the 3 Baltic countries, and Slovakia, as far as I'm aware. Maybe others have done it in the meantime. Let me say at the outset that this, let's call it for shorthand, revolution in Belarus has been both unexpected, it's caught us all by surprise, it's been traumatic, and it remains, well, the dynamics are still unpredictable, and the consequences remain unforeseen. Hence, it's a really challenging topic for us to address. I'll ask each speaker, the 3 speakers, to give us 2 or 3 minutes worth of their very general impressions, your reactions to this last six weeks. Has it taken you by surprise? Where is it going? What is the importance? So just preliminary remarks, then we'll get into more detailed substance. Let's start off, well, I see Nigel is top of my screen here. So Nigel, would you lead off?
Thank you very much, Bohdan. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to share views today, and particularly in the company of such distinguished fellow panelists. Just very brief initial thoughts then. It took just about everyone by surprise. As I say, it takes longer than you think and happens faster than you expect. There were signs even in the lead up to the presidential election campaign that maybe there was something in the air, in particular the fact that figures who had been important parts of the elite in various ways had sought to become candidates. Of course, they had been unable to do so, but the sense there that they were making choices of that kind because they felt there was, despite the very authoritarian and well-known nature of the regime, there was something different potentially this time. But it's easy to overread these things in hindsight. And yes, indeed, it has been a great surprise. What's especially significant is that this isn't something that happened immediately after the falsified election results and then simply receded. We've seen that before, notably in 2010. What's different this time, fundamentally different, is that we've really seen a decisive and irreversible shift in the moral, psychological and political landscape in Belarus. There is something, a genie genuinely out of the bottle that just will not go back again. The breadth of the support, as well as its solidity, is truly impressive. This is no longer Minsk-centric. This is something that's happening in towns and cities large and small from border to border. It's taking in social groups that have never participated in politics before, notably, but not only, in the major state-owned enterprises, in a sense, the crown jewels of Lukashenko's political economy. And yet, we've not seen this process come to fruition yet. We've not seen the outcome that most people now hope for. We have a situation that it's hard to think of any direct parallels with in any other country of this kind. I tend to think of what's happening now in Belarus as, in a sense, the completion of a 30-year cycle of change, of the search for freedom by peaceful means across Central and Eastern and Southern Europe, which began in neighboring Poland in 1989. Now, all of those happened fairly quickly, certainly, I think, more quickly than we've seen today. So we have a novel situation of a regime that is essentially isolated. It's occupying its own country, and yet it's still in power. It still retains the means of force, of violence, but without any sort of moral or political legitimacy or any prospect of regaining that. So that's the situation we stand at now. That we can talk in due course perhaps about the dynamics, how that situation might change, and the role of external forces and countries. But let me conclude my remarks for the moment with that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Nigel. Anders, Aslund, over to you. Initial impressions without not necessarily repeating some of the things that Nigel has already said.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try to do so. I'll, of course, agree with what Nigel said, but one thing is different. I thought this was long overdue. I was in Belarus the first time in 1986, and I was struck by a few things. It was clearly the most honest people in the Soviet Union. It was the only place in the Soviet Union where people categorically refused to take tips everywhere. It was very clean and well-functioning. One got the sense that this was the last place where the Soviet economic system functioned. The tragedy is that the Soviet economic system has continued to function, and it only goes so far. So this is the big underlying problem. Nigel mentioned 2010. I had expected this to happen 2010, 2011. Belarus had 109% inflation in 2011. It looked as if the economy was really collapsing because Lukashenko, as he does from time to time, had run out of foreign reserves. And in the end, Putin very reluctantly bailed him out, but he did so at a big cost, taking over the gas pipelines and some enterprise assets, some which it seems that Lukashenko in the end did not deliver. Belarus has had complete stagnation since 2012. Of course, people in Belarus are quite modern. If you make one simple observation, COVID-19 infection has gone down sharply during these protests. And then you ask why? Well, look up on the protests, they have a mask everybody, because Lukashenko is against people wearing masks, just like Trump. But unlike Trump, there are a few people who, if any, who obey Lukashenko. So therefore, we are really seeing something very, very different. As Nigel said, a very united people. What this reminds me of is not at all Maidan. I was there during the Orange Revolution and soon after Euromaidan. This is much more like Poland in 1980. I was in Szczecin on the Polish coast and saw the strikes when they took place then. And this was much more like that. And part of it is that Belarus still has a Soviet economy. So it has massive overstaffing of tough men in hard hats that are ready to act together as the Polish shipyards workers and miners did in 1980. But that also means that we don't have the political maturity. There's no strategy, there's no program. It makes perfect sense to stay together and only have these three elementary demands. No, let out all political prisoners. Lukashenko must go have new elections, but not having any sense where you belong. So I'm rather tired of hearing this from Belarusian civil activists. We want to be sovereign. We don't want to choose between Europe and Russia. We want to be Belarus. Well, this is like Bismarck said in that the big questions of our time are not decided by majority vote and discussions, but by blood and iron. And this is the realpolitik situation where the Belarusians are. And I don't see that they understand it, nor do I see how they can manage it.
Well, early days, as you've said, thank you. And we remember that it took Solidarity quite a long time to achieve its goals. It didn't happen overnight, did it? Or even in a month or a year or two. Over to you, Andreas. Your take on what we've been seeing in Belarus.
Yeah, I was frankly surprised. I also should say that I haven't been to Belarus for a while, so I do not have as fresh impressions from the last years as Nigel or perhaps Anders or you, Bohdan. And I always felt that Belarus is a sort of strange outlier, because if you look at all the countries from the post-Soviet countries, from Estonia, at least the Christian ones, down to Armenia, we had these sort of uprisings and color revolutions, velvet revolutions, and it seemed as if Belarus belongs, perhaps as the name of the organization says, to this Eurasian space, to the Eurasian Union, to the Eurasian Economic Union. It has perhaps another political culture than all the countries around the country. But then it did happen, and that was a pleasant surprise. It was also, insofar, to me, a surprise that there wasn't, let's say, an indication of this sort of geopolitical reorientation as we had, for instance, in Armenia already under Sargsyan, when Sargsyan was negotiating for a year or so quite successfully before he stopped it, an association agreement with the European Union. That is now mostly forgotten, that even Armenia had this sort of geopolitical reorientation going on, which was then stopped by Putin. I think it was quite obvious that Putin did so because he had the instrument here of Armenia's support in the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, and so Armenia had no choice, in fact, and then had a velvet revolution 4 years later, after Sargsyan had to stop the negotiation of the association agreement. Nothing like that was in Belarus. Belarus, in distinction even to the other members of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Organization of the Collective Security Treaty, has signed on the 8th of December 1999 a union treaty with Russia. The 8th of December is insofar important here as this was the 8th anniversary of the signing of the Belarus agreement. Also, in Belarus signed, and it was a sort of a reversal or a partial reversal of the Belarus agreement. This treaty of 1999 has been also ratified fully, and there are actually some external trappings and a small budget that the union state has, but it has not, in fact, come into being. Although on paper it should have come into being a long time ago. So Belarus seemed to be this strange outlier in the region, and frankly, I had lost hope, and I did not expect that. I saw, of course, also the developments on the ground. I visited, for instance, the European Humanities University, first in Minsk and then later on in Vilnius, and I saw also the young people from Belarus with other inclinations, but that seemed to have not translated for such a long time into some sort of effective political action. That this is now indeed a pleasant surprise, at least for me.
Thank you. Okay, let me just give you an idea of how I would like us to proceed. I'd like us to focus on Belarus itself briefly and the choices facing the movement there. Will it split? Will it become more radicalized? Will it end up making these difficult choices? Was the reluctance to self-identify geopolitically one of political tact, knowing the economic and political clout of Russia, or was it naivety, whatever you think? Secondly, I'd like us then to broaden it out. I will ask a question to Ukraine, because it's the British-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce is organizing it, so implications for Ukraine, implications for Russia, and then finally the broader implications for Europe. We've got Brexit going on, but my question will be something to the effect, has what has happened in Eastern Europe galvanized the East European, Central European countries to take a more unified stance, purposeful stance vis-a-vis Brussels and as regards the future of Europe, you know, is a kind of rebalancing of forces, not having the economic clout, but perhaps the political input. Anyway, who would like to go first and share some impressions on what are the choices? We've heard a little bit about this already in your opening remarks, but when you look at the movement that hasn't yet crystallized, as Nigel said, in Belarus, what are the choices today? What will they be 2 or 3 weeks down the road? And has the situation changed now that Lukashenko has actually gone ahead today and said, damn you all, I still want to be president? What struck me really also is, if this is true, Peskov said that Moscow wasn't informed. Now, are they telling the truth? If Moscow wasn't informed, that seems very strange and insecure on the part of Lukashenko. Who would like to go first of our 3 experts?
Well, I can start. If Peskov has said something, it cannot be true. It's a simple rule. Putin has 2 advisors for foreign policy. Peskov, who lies all the time, so therefore he speaks much more, and Yuri Ushakov, who's a serious person and who tells us the truth. So this is the simple rule. As I already said, I think that we will see a radicalization. So, and that will naturally lead to a split. These broad national fronts, they normally don't last for long. What has been very impressive and untypical so far is that the protests have stayed massive and peaceful all the time, which would suggest that this will be a bit untypical, that we won't see such a split and radicalization. But Lukashenko is now entirely Putin's man. And this means that Belarusians that so far have not identified Lukashenko with Putin for many reasons, they will do so. And this will mean that they turn against Putin. And if they turn against Putin, they will also turn against Russia after some time. I dare not suggest how soon. And of course, it's very striking that it's the Belarusian flag that is all over. And it's also interesting that the Belarusian language does not seem to be that central. So it's the Belarusian flag rather than the Belarusian language. And to touch upon your next question, this means that is in Ukraine that it has become more of a civil national identification than a linguistic national identification as it was in the early 90s, which meant that the nationalists became too radical and too isolated earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. I've noticed also that the language is featuring again. Suddenly in the last few weeks, we're hearing a lot of Belarusian being spoken, certainly on TV in the interviews. We were told that it was almost dying out, but there seems to be simultaneously two processes going on. One, a kind of democratic revolution, civil society being reborn, if you want, and at the same time, a kind of instant national rebirth, which is restoring national pride and a sense of statehood. Anyway, over to who would like to go next of our Nigel? And okay.
We just pick up a couple of these themes. So one question worth asking is what might change either within, I don't even want to call them the opposition, they're simply the population now, that's really what we're talking about. What might change in the population or in the regime that occupies it that might shift the dynamic or balance of advantages. So as far as the population goes, as Anders says, it's retained very impressive unity and a peaceful discipline. It's often kept ahead of the game, innovating tactics of various kinds that have kept the regime off balance in various ways. The most recent was both literally and metaphorically unmasking the perpetrators of violence, literally in the sense of pulling off the balaclavas and seeing those Amonsi run, flee from that was quite a sight. But metaphorically too, we've seen data dumps now of the identity of members of these repressive structures and so on. That's just the latest example. There's no sense of a demobilization or loss of energy yet. The worry, I think, is that we might, in the worst case, see a dramatic escalation of lethal force by the regime on a truly horrible scale that we haven't seen in Europe for literally decades. Now, thank goodness that hasn't happened, and we must hope it doesn't, of course. But let's be clear, Lukashenko would have no moral restraint whatsoever about doing that. That's, I fear, something that might sort of potentially change. That raises the question of the role and loyalty of the military. Now the military have not, as I understand it, been directly involved in this repression yet. That's been a matter for other structures. And the mission statement of the military is to defend the country from external threats, rather than serve as an accessory of the repression of their own people. So there's an interesting question of ultimate loyalties there. We've not seen the imposition of martial law, for example. Economic exhaustion and difficulties faced by people, especially those on strike or who have been sacked as a consequence of their participation in demonstrations. That's a potential worry, and there may be a role for European partners in helping with strike funds and so on to sustain that. On the other side, on the side of the regime, so I think what we see now is the whole question of loyalties being tested. And I note with interest that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has more than once appealed to their higher loyalties and has said, well, if you cease to support and implement the will of this illegitimate and repressive regime, then we will forgive you and we will welcome you. And that seems to me smart. There may be an additional complementary role for sanctions to play in that, not just on individuals, but on entire structures, actually. So that's maybe something that can be revisited. And I think if we look more broadly at how fundamental change takes place in situations like this, it's almost always requires some kind of split within elites. If elites remain completely united, those who carry the big sticks, it's very hard, I think, for even the boldest and and most fearless and dignified population to bring about change. So there are a couple of dynamics to consider there. Then there's the question of Russian thinking and calculation. To Anders' point earlier, I take his point about as a geopolitics and so on. I think, though, that it had to be said and had to be meant on the part of the leaders of the movement for change in Belarus that they are focused wholly on the demand for change. They had at least to try to and not give Russia any pretext to claim that it's some kind of explicitly sort of pro-Western movement. Unfortunately, of course, Belarus has had geopolitics thrust on it by Russia, but it's even more transparent to everyone now just how fictitious and malign the narratives are that Russia is concocting to try to justify that. And among those narratives, to the point about Ukraine, is the claim made by, I think it was by Lavrov, that 300 or so specially trained Ukrainians have infiltrated Belarus. I mean, this is obviously as much complete nonsense as everything else that has been said from Russia in recent weeks about the string pulling and influence from the West. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Just a quick question to you, Nigel, but were you struck by the fact that Putin did not seem to support, when Lukashenko met with him one-on-one, the idea that, you know, NATO is massing on Poland's and Belarusian border, and that this threat is imminent? You know, Lukashenko was playing this card, that this was part of the justification for his tough stance, and Putin seemed to not commit himself to that. How do you read that?
On that particular occasion and in public, no, I don't think he did. Much has been said about the body language, of course, of that exchange. But there have been other voices that have come out of Moscow, including the head of the SVR, who have made it very clear that they think that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is under America's complete control, and again, fabrications of this kind. So maybe not on that occasion, but I think we've seen very clearly efforts, rather desperate efforts, and wholly implausible, to construct that kind of narrative. I'm just very briefly on Putin. So yes, I mean, Lukashenko is Putin's man, but I'm not sure Putin has many alternatives either. However much they cordially detest one another and have done so for some time, what other game in town is there for Putin? It seems to be, in a sense, they are stuck with each other. That's how they would see it at this point. So Lukashenko's position may not be as weak with respect to Russia as it first appears, if it's true that Putin, as well as Lukashenko, has no realistic alternative.
Andreas, perhaps a comment from you without commenting about Tikhanovskaya herself, but is there a lack of leadership, or do you suspect that there is more leadership behind the scenes, the instructions for the demonstrations, where to meet, how to proceed through Nechta and other networks, Belsat? Is there a lack of leadership, or is it simply a leadership that is not making itself evident?
No, I think that is actually partly similar to the Orange Revolution and to the Euromaidan, where there was also not that much leadership. It was more sort of an spontaneous networking, very horizontal. And while it may have appeared from outside that there were political leaders much more present, of course, in Ukraine than in Belarus, I think most of the actual work was done from the ground and not on instruction from above. I wanted to maybe also speculate here a little bit because about the future, because it looked, at least for me, until about a month ago, that one could have had something in Belarus like one had in Armenia in 2018. A velvet revolution where a new leader comes into place, the old one goes peacefully, and the country remains in the Eurasian Economic Union, the country remains in the Organization of the Collective Security Treaty, and there is, so to say, a scenario that actually I think everybody should have liked. I think that perhaps many of the protesters were in the beginning hoping for, that, you know, Belarus would remain in its geopolitical situation. There wouldn't be a major change. The West, I think, was perhaps also hoping for something like in Armenia in 2018, and one would have thought that Russia would have been also interested in something like that. But for rather inexplicable reasons, they went for supporting Lukashenko, and Lukashenko did not go as Sargsyan went after a short while in Armenia, and now they're heading for conflict, for real conflict inside. I'm as pessimistic here as Nigel and Anders that this will radicalize, and the corridor for a peaceful solution is becoming smaller, and also I think that at the end this may get a geopolitical dimension, although it did not have this there were no EU flags at the beginning, and I think there's still no EU flags or any other Western flags on the streets of Minsk or the other cities. But it may turn out to be this way because Russia has taken this domestic political stance, which it avoided doing in Armenia in 2018, and then actually build up a more or less good relationship with Nikol Pashinyan. And I thought they would have had here also with Barbariko and Tsepkalo, they would have had people whom they could have supported and with whom they might have continued the old alliance. But now they've thrown their full support behind Lukashenko. Nigel said there was no other option. I wonder, though, you know, whether they might not have been wiser, so to say, to pick somebody. Maybe it was already too late. Maybe when the elections happened, that was already too late. They should have done that earlier, and then should have built up a new leader, and with whom they would have continued the old alliance. Perhaps not the union state, but at least within the Eurasian Economic Union and the CSTO. But now it seems to be all becoming more and more conflictual and more geopolitical because of this alliance between Lukashenko and Putin.
Andreas, okay, I want to move on, but just throwing out for a quick comment, was it not strange then that Lukashenko arrested people he accused of being, in effect, Moscow puppets in the elections beforehand? And let's say, the exchanges between official Minsk and Moscow in the earlier part of this year were quite tense, and it seemed that Lukashenko was genuinely worried that Moscow was intervening to push him out. But that seems to have evaporated now. Why has he not released on some excuse some of the pro-Moscow, supposedly pro-Moscow candidates that are still in prison? Any takes on that from anybody?
Well, I think it's quite easy that Putin likes dictators, Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Bashar Assad, and he does not want anybody to be exchanged by the people. So if somebody is popular, he's bad in himself. Putin wants to treat now Lukashenko as any regional governor. He had a regional governor from the Far East visiting Lukashenko because Lukashenko is already not at Putin's level. He's at the level of regional governor.
Nigel?
Yeah, that's entirely right. And in fact, most of the ambassadors that Russia has sent to Minsk, with the exception of one who had to be recalled, had previously been regional governors within Russia rather than career diplomats. And I think that's one piece of evidence that supports what Anders is saying. But to Andreas's point as well, I think this is now very important. I mean, the best outcome, perhaps in principle, would be a situation where it's possible to square the circle of having a leader in Belarus who is both accountable to the population and is freely elected, and who is also capable of having a good relationship with Russia. But I worry that Russia would not accept that, precisely because one of the key drivers of Russian policy now is essentially internally oriented. So Lukashenko has been in power for 26 years. When Putin stands in 2024, as I think everyone expects him to, he will have been in power for 24 years. It sets a bad precedent as far as the Kremlin is concerned for a neighboring autocrat, long-standing, of another Eastern Slavic state to have been removed by peaceful people power. I think that is something that in its own terms, Putin would want to avoid. So that leads to the pessimistic conclusion that no democratic leader would be palatable to Moscow simply by virtue of being democratic. Or to put it another way, Belarus and a free Belarus might wish to have a good relationship with Russia, but it's far less clear that Russia would be able to have a good relationship with the free Belarus. And that's I'm afraid, a very depressing conclusion.
And I hear from many of my Belarusian friends that the longer this goes on and the longer the regime uses these brutal methods, which are identified not with Europe's, but with Eurasian ways of dealing with society, that this is alienating even those who wanted to remain, shall we say, sit on the fence or politically neutral or whatever, benevolently disposed, to give Russia the benefit of the doubt. Okay, let's spend a few minutes, because it's the British-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce has asked us to hold this discussion. Let's please give me your thoughts on how this could impact on Ukraine, other than the long border and if the Russian military is there. And what can we expect of Ukraine? Should President Zelensky, who I remember when he won the election, his first statement was, "This is a victory. This is an example for all states in the CIS, this election result." I realize that he's got the war on, he's got to keep an open line, open to the extent it's possible with Moscow, dialogue, but is he doing the right thing by allowing the Balts and the Poles to take, the front role, or should he be more assertive at this point, where, especially after today? Volunteers first.
If nobody else, then I'll
go on. Go on, please.
I've recently seen here in Ukraine a TV station show which was, I think, closer to the opposition platform. And there the invited experts seem to agree that actually Lukashenko is a good choice for Ukraine, because they know him, and he has allegedly, that was at least the argument, sort of secured the northern border of Ukraine by not letting Russia there come into Ukraine through this border. And they've basically treated Belarus as a piece of land that is only in this capacity of interest. I don't think so. I think actually in Ukraine's interest is the continuation of the protests and the victory of the protesters, because that will lead Belarus, I think, almost by definition into this sort of more pro-European, pro-Western camp, although this is not something, obviously, that was at the start of these protests that were a purely domestic affair at the end. And this will then open, I would say, with the new leadership in Belarus also, the opportunity of an entirely new relationship. And of course, then what comes to mind immediately is the Lublin triangle, into which Belarus would fit in very well. This is still something very far away, but as we are now seeing this national awakening in Belarus, and in this alliance between Lukashenko and Putin, we may end up at the end of the game somewhere there. This is still very speculative, but I think there's more to win here overall for Ukraine in this situation than to lose. And let's not forget that in the most crucial moments, Lukashenko has supported Putin, for instance, in the voting in the UN General Assembly in March 2014. Belarus was the only European country, well, together with Armenia, if you count Armenia in, and Russia, to vote against the resolution condemning the Crimea annexation. So Lukashenko had always an ambivalent position, and he's now sort of getting into bed with Putin. And so I think the risks are larger here for Ukraine with Lukashenko staying in power.
Anders?
And I agree with Andreas' main point here that Belarus is now in, so to say, the velvet revolution camp, whether it succeeds or not. And that means that Belarus comes closer to Ukraine in the long run. But in between, we have a lot of complications. One is that Belarus is now the fourth biggest trading partner of Ukraine. And this means that trade to Russia and from Russia goes through Belarus to considerable extent. It's something like 6% of Ukraine's foreign trade. So this is likely to be blocked now. Militarily, Russia will move in with these various maneuvers, and that means that Ukraine gets a new security threat from the north. On the positive side, we have noticed that Russia has moved towards a real ceasefire in Donbass since this happened. And of course, Ukraine has withdrawn its ambassador from Belarus. So it will be very complicated for Ukraine to manage this situation, while the dominant feature is positive.
A quick question to you, just to continue. Ukraine managed in 2015-16 to break this energy stranglehold that Russia had on its economy by taking oil and gas from other sources, from the West. Do you think that in the longer term, if Belarus were to choose in the next months or year to look westward, that with the help of the Scandinavians and Poland, the Balts, that it could also become less dependent or independent of Russia in the energy sphere, or is that impossible in their situation?
Technically, it's possible. As you probably know, the Odessa-Brody pipeline is now being used to take Azeri oil from Odessa to one of the Belarusian refineries. One load of American oil went to the Belarusian refineries. So the pipelines are there. You can take it both through Odessa and through Lithuania. And gas, now we are seeing that gas is turning back and forth. So Belarus could get gas being reversed from Poland, since Gazprom seems to be giving up on the pipeline through Belarus and Poland also. So the possibilities are there, but it's a matter of price. And I think it will be of interest. And of course, Poland is now taking or about to take gas through pipeline from Norway. So this is quickly developing. Both oil and gas are really becoming markets to a much greater extent in this part of the world.
Right. Could we now broaden it out to the broader European, the implications for Europe or geopolitics generally? I mean, I was suggesting at the beginning that perhaps Belarus is the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle for the Europe as we would perhaps like to know it or see it after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's ironic that it was at the Belarusian Pushta that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was made a fact by the signature of the agreement there. And yet this state, apart from the very first years, has been held back somehow. If you want, as my Belarusian friends say, we were abducted. We're a European child, we were kidnapped, and we're only now, you know, having the blindfold taken off our eyes and are looking around and are able to decide for ourselves, or are trying to decide for ourselves. So the broader implications.
Yeah, I have to leave after this. So let me
Okay.
just say, Bohdan, I think it's a terrible case that Cyprus has been able to block all sanctions from the EU. And this is completely discrediting the European Union. It must get either Cyprus or its decision making together. The EU just looks embarrassing, I say as a Swedish citizen. But thank you very much, my pleasure.
Thank you for your participation, Anders. You have to go and participate in another event. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us and insights.
Thank you.
Nigel is still going to be with us, I hope, for another 10 minutes or so, hopefully.
Yes, indeed.
So I give the floor to you. I give you the mic if there's anything you wanted to say on that. Particularly in the context, let's look at it more broadly from a historical point of view. You're speaking from London. We've got Brexit. Britain presumably is, you know, it's still part of NATO. It's strategically part of the joint Euro-Atlantic effort or position. And yet it's probably going to be a little bit more of a maverick in foreign policy and could have more of an independent voice to some extent. I don't want to exaggerate that. And yet we've got these developments in Eastern Europe where suddenly, say the Balts, look at the activity of the Lithuanians, say, and the others who are saying, hey, Brussels, you're not doing your job. We have to speak up on behalf of our neighbors and the neighborhood. Do you see some kind of reconfiguration implicitly taking place?
Yeah, well, firstly, I'll just say on the back of Anders' comment that as a recent former EU citizen, I have to agree with his point about the EU unfortunately being shown to be less than the sum of its parts in the recent decisions or non-decisions about sanctions, and that creates a worrying precedent, I think, especially at a time when separate issue, but also very important, when the EU is considering sanctions, for example, on Russia as a consequence of the Navalny affair. I think this is what Cyprus has done is alarming. To the larger point, so yes, of course the EU and Britain are still working out what their relationship will be. It's the stuff of headlines pretty much every day now. When Britain was a member of the EU, it maintained a strong and principled position on issues like this, and also with respect to Ukraine as well. I see no reason in principle why, having left the EU, Britain's, as it were, moral and political compass on matters like this should change in any way. It is important for them to remain closely engaged with the EU on these issues. So even though they're not part of EU decision-making, they will support and encourage the EU to maintain a firm position. Britain, by virtue of, and again, this has been the stuff of headlines in recent days here, by virtue of its role as an international financial center, of course, has a role to play in ensuring that the right sort of money and not the wrong sort of money flows into London and that the wrong stuff isn't laundered. I think a closer scrutiny of some of Belarus's flows would be very important here. On the EU, so Ursula von der Leyen has said that she wants a commission oriented towards a strategic Europe, And I think for too long, EU policy has played a Lukashenko-inspired game of allowing Lukashenko to reach out to it for certain limited, conditional, and very reversible benefits. And that has encouraged some in the EU to, in the past, limit the strength or severity of the EU's response to human rights violations in Belarus. And that game now is completely broken. There is no reason why, given the closeness now of Belarus and Russia, the fact that Belarus is now openly saying we no longer pursue a multi-vector foreign policy, it's all about Russia, they've been explicit about that. there's no stake for Europe any longer in moderating its response to the outrages in Belarus for some supposed geopolitical purposes. So the EU's interests and its values pull in the same direction, and it needs to support what the population wants and not this discredited regime.
Right, Nigel, I know you have to go very quickly, but we're very fortunate. I see that we have another ambassador, former ambassador, Jan Peklo, the ambassador in Ukraine, who's watching, and I will invite him to give an unofficial view from Poland, especially of a person that was active in Ukraine, of the situation. None of us have mentioned Washington and the forthcoming election and how that might impact if the situation is prolonged. Before I go over to Ambassador Peklo, Andreas, you wanted to say something, please? Andreas?
Yes, I would also hope, apart from the concrete political decisions that have to be made yet, and this strange situation with Cyprus has to be resolved, I would also hope that the case of Belarus should lead to a general rethinking about how many, I think, in the West have conceptualized East European geopolitics in the past, because that I think the mainstream still thinks that this is all about the big players. It's about NATO and the US and the EU and perhaps George Soros as well. And, you know, you have all these influences there on these countries, and then they have these color revolutions, and then Russia doesn't like the color revolutions. And then because all of this foreign mingling, we then get into these fundamental conflicts with Moscow. And basically, you know, there's an almost equal blame to be put here to the West and to Russia, who could not withhold themselves and were sort of expanding into each other's supposed sphere of influence. And here we have with Belarus now, after Armenia, this is the second such case, and maybe it's just geographically closer and should become therefore more important for Brussels and Berlin and Paris and so on. Where a country where the security organ is still called KGB, and which has a union treaty with Russia, which is ratified, and which is a founding member of the Eurasian Economic Union, and it's a founding member of the Organization of the Collective Security Treaty. And you wonder how the Americans, or how NATO, or how George Soros, or how the EU got into Minsk and organized all these protests, yeah, as they did, of course, in Tiflis and in Chisinau and in Kyiv. Hopefully now people will a little bit reinterpret this whole story about domestic and foreign affairs in Eastern Europe and understand that, you know, we may think of ourselves, we Westerners, as, you know, being the main players here, but in fact we have very little there to do. And the Belarusians did not need any George Soroses or European commissioners or McCain's or Newlands or all these people to get the idea to throw out Lukashenko. So, and then the other story here is, of course, about nationalism. This is also very popular, especially in Germany, a very popular narrative. You know, you have these racist Balts, and then you have this crazy Saakashvili in Georgia, and then you have the fascist Ukrainians, and the Russians are constantly, you know, by all these crazy people around Russia, they're constantly put into these deadlock situations where they then sort of overreact. But you have to understand that they overreact to the Balts and the Georgians and the Ukrainians. And now you have a very pro-Russian country, a very which is explicitly where everybody says we are brother nation with the Russians and we want to have good relations and so on. But still it doesn't seem to work. You still have these uprisings and you still have the national flag. You have a national reawakening, and the people speak Russian who have this national reawakening and don't insist on speaking Belarusian. And so I hope this will lead to a rethinking in the Western epistemic communities, diplomatic services, in the political landscapes, because you know, I'm really fed up with all these geopolitical stories and stories about nationalism, racism, fascism, genocide, and all that.
Thank you, Andreas. Very good point. Ambassador Gould-Davis, I think you have to leave us fairly soon. So if you disappear, I'm thanking you in advance for your very valuable contribution. I'd like to invite Ambassador Jan Pieklo to say a few words to us. He wasn't ready. I hadn't prepared him. So just off the cuff, could you share your impressions on what's happening and its broader significance? Please, but switch on your mic. Can you hear me, Ambassador Pieklo?
Yes, I hear you. Thank you. Thank you for invitation. It's extremely interesting to listen to my colleagues, my friends, to listen to their comments. We know that Poland has a long border with Belarus. And for a while, Poland also shared a part of the territory, which now belongs to Belarus. So we share pretty similar culture, and we can communicate. We understand each other, because if Paul speaks Belarusian, so it's like speaking Polish. These languages are very, very similar, like also Ukrainian. And as a matter of fact, it was a surprise for everybody what happened in Belarus. And because it was a surprise, so it means that it was very spontaneous. It wasn't organized. It was not Soros, not fascists from Ukraine, not Bolsheviks, nobody. These were the people. And a lot of these people, the young fellows, they visited Poland. We have thousands of them living in Poland and traveling from Poland to Belarus, from Belarus to Poland. And they know how life in the EU country looks like. So they were interested in having similar standards. At least they were interested in having a free elections. And unfortunately, it was impossible. What is extremely interesting right now, it is Minsk agreement. It is what will happen with trilateral contact groups and with Minsk as a platform, as a site for these Donbas negotiations. And it looks that it's done. It's gone with the wind of history. And it's quite clear for Ukrainians that Minsk is not any longer a good place for continuing these negotiations. It looks that it's also quite clear for Dmitry Kozak, who explicitly said that, oh, no, Ukraine is not going to follow the agreements, Steinmeier's formula, all this stuff. So it looks that it is the result of the protests in Minsk that we will be having an impasse, a big impasse in negotiations between Ukrainians and Russians. Probably instead of negotiations, we will be having a new confrontation, I'm afraid. And there is also an issue of water supply to Crimea. From the very beginning, Poland was very supportive for all human rights organizations, civic movements in Belarus, and we contributed also our taxpayers' money to found the stipends, to invite young Belarusians for studying to Poland, and we are really proud that we have good relations. And it's not a coincidence that two countries, Lithuania and Poland, were interested in helping in pushing the agenda on the EU table. And it's really a shame that that Cyprus blocked the sanctions. Although for me it is not a surprise, because Cyprus was always a big laundromat for dirty Russian oligarchs' money. And I'm afraid that Cyprus did it on purpose. It's not the issue of Turkey. It's an issue of Russian influence. And it is the reason why it was blocked. And I was personally very confused listening to the comments by Joseph Borrell about his frustration. We really need to do something about it, because
right,
it is the end.
Ambassador Piekło, thank you very much. Those of who are watching may not be aware, Ambassador Piekło was the Poland's ambassador until quite recently in Kyiv. There are a lot of questions that I've just noticed. Former colleague Craig Oliphant asks about the Armenian scenario. We've gone through that a bit earlier. There are questions here about Chinese investment. Unfortunately, Anders has left us. I had hoped we would tackle that, unless Andreas feels confident to take that on, and many other questions. But look, one final comment from you, but please, Ambassador Piekło, keep it short. This notion of events in Belarus galvanizing Eastern and Central Europe to reconfigurate Europe, as it were, with perhaps the Lublin Triangle as the start, but the activities shown by the Baltic countries, by Poland, by Romania, by Slovakia today, etc., at a time when we've got Brexit in the West, and there are changes going on in Europe. So just your off-the-cuff thoughts on perhaps longer-term implications for Europe as a whole, especially a Europe of shared common values as opposed to perhaps conflicting economic interests. And also, Andreas, you there. Then 2 or 3 questions if we have time from the audience. I don't think we will have time to answer the written ones, unfortunately. I confess I only just saw they're only switched on. So I'll give you time to think. Ambassador Andreas, perhaps you go first quickly. 2-3 minutes.
Yeah, I think the Cyprus case is also perhaps in a strange way a metaphor for Ukraine. What lets me also to have the same suspicion as Jan Piekło about the real intentions of Cyprus here and the real determinants of Cyprus's behavior is that the Cypriotic leadership should know that the EU is dependent on Turkey nowadays, and that the EU, because of the refugee issue, cannot go as harsh as maybe it would be from the Cypriotic position justified to deal, but they're still blocking as harsh as they do these sanctions. And that is in a way, on an abstract level, exactly what Russia would also like to do in Ukraine. It would like to have some sort of region in Ukraine that is the story about the Donbass in a way. It wants to have something in Ukraine from which it there can sort of influence the foreign policy of Ukraine. And with Cyprus, it has gotten now, if it's true that indeed there is a Russian influence behind Cyprus's behavior, an instrument of influence. And this is the sort of the Russian way to do things, and it applies not only to the European Union but also to Ukraine. And I just hope that this whole conflict will improve the Western understanding of the Kremlin's modes of behavior, and that this will be now an eye opener. In Germany, frankly, there are now signs that the mood is indeed changing. After all, the last 2 or 3 weeks have been quite surprising, actually, in terms of the discourse in Berlin about Russia, which has become much more critical. I think it's also perhaps a little bit due to the fact that Germany is now looking for a more hawkish stance towards Russia, so it can justify an end of the Nord Stream 2 project, which the US has already ended, but it has to be now justified by Berlin to get out of this project. And perhaps this also partly explains the more hawkish discourse in Berlin. But on the whole, I think there is now a rethinking going on in Germany against the background of the events in Belarus and the Navalny case about Russia's foreign policies.
Okay, over to Ambassador Pieklo. Put your mic on, please. Mike.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Andreas, for mentioning the very important issue of Nord Stream 2. And from the Polish position, not only from the Polish position, the decision of German government to quit the project will be a test for the EU solidarity. The EU solidarity in the economic terms and also in the political terms, because I remember quite well that the comments by Angela Merkel were of this kind, that it's a political project, but it's basically an economic project. So we need to say no to this project because we know that all these monies Russia possibly could earn will be spent for, you know, for military purposes. So we shouldn't allow this to happen. And I think that it is what we are just lacking right now in European Union. The strategic geopolitical thinking about common security interests, and strengthening the transatlantic community is the best medicine for this. And I'm afraid that some of the comments by President Macron, and unfortunately also some comments from the Berlin, they are not going into this direction. And maybe it was the reason why Poland and other countries, Armenia, Baltics, they came up with the idea of creating a kind of economic zone. I'm talking about 5Cs initiative.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. Look, we're coming to an end. Let me just give you an idea of some of the questions that were asked that we haven't had time to deal with in writing. There was a specific question about China's investment potential in Belarus and Ukraine, how this can affect orientation and cultural affinity away from Putin's Ruski Mir, bearing in mind that China is already Ukraine's key trading partner. Could this be a major development? Perhaps the BUCC might want to have a special discussion on that theme, on China's role in this region. I think it's very topical. Another question is again on a repeat of the Armenian scenario. I think we addressed that earlier on in the discussion. Then there is Paul Nyland made a very good point. He said, remember the Maidan was peaceful until about 2 or 3 months into it, and only when a force was used by the security forces, there was retaliation, and then, you know, the whole thing exploded. And he said, we're already into the second month of a peaceful revolution in Belarus, but if Lukashenko overreacts even more and uses even more brutal force, could this be a game changer in the situation? What happens? So these are some of the questions that people are asking. We haven't had time to really deal with that. I would take one quick question from one of the a live question, if somebody is ready and to quickly pose a question. There I see on my screen. Okay, please go ahead, introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Vera Horton. Can you hear me? Hope so. Yes. I'm Belarusian living in London. I believe the whole situation with Russian active interference in Belarus is very much economic driven. And Russia is trying to hold the position of their economic appearance and presence in Belarus. My question is, how world is going to help Belarus, the new Belarus government, to help establish a new economic program that will be transparent and all players will be able to understand how Belarus will either secure their positions or reject their positions? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a pity that Anders has left us and Nigel. They would have been perfect to answer that. I don't know if Andreas wants to chip in, but difficult questions, I certainly don't have the answers. You know, plenty to think about. Thank you for flagging that. One other question out there, anybody else?
I can say maybe a couple of words, I mean, very Please. Obvious words, is that first of all, I think Belarus is less difficult here for the West to handle than Ukraine, because it's simply smaller, and to think about some sort of plan here is much more practical. And also there is now the experience with the association agreements and the whole cooperation of the West with Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, that could be applied. On the other hand, you know, as long as Belarus remains a part of the Eurasian Economic Union, well, this is basically going to define where Belarus will be standing in economic terms. And there's, for instance, no association agreement possible with Belarus. And also Armenia did not get a full association agreement with even under Pashinyan. They got an enhanced partnership agreement. One could imagine something like that for Belarus. Also, other things would have to change. Belarus would have to become a member of the Council of Europe and so on. But it's difficult. It's in a way far more complicated here than with countries like Georgia and Ukraine that are less ambivalent in their orientation and in their international embeddedness than countries like Armenia and Belarus.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we're coming to the end. We said we'd finish at around 5:15. Closing remarks, Andreas, put your thinking cap on, 2 words, and Ambassador Pieklo, I'll invite you to replace the other colleagues. Just final thoughts, you know, maybe more historical, philosophical, but let's also address the issue of the Belarus people here. I mean, they're in a very difficult situation and unclear how things are going to go, how the regime is going to react further, what is going to happen tonight as mass protests have been called for in response to the self-inauguration of Lukashenko. So your thoughts at this stage, if you want do's and don'ts from lessons learned, a tall order, I know. But Andreas, I know you're up to it here. Please switch on your mic.
Well, yeah, although Belarus is a small country, it needs obviously a lot of attention because it's a geopolitically in a key situation. And it has also a larger meaning in that one could argue that the fate of Belarus will also co-determine the future of Russia because of the close connections and because the whole Kremlin argument about the allegedly fascist Ukrainian nationalists does not really apply to the nationally awakened Belarusians. And I think that that argument will be also very difficult to make for the Kremlin propaganda. There are certain limits to this sort of manipulation that you can do. And therefore, I think this has really a rather big, although the country is small, a rather big geopolitical importance for the EU, and there should be as much attention as possible. What exactly to do and how exactly, for instance, to overcome the veto of Cyprus is something that I cannot say here from Kyiv. But this is not a trivial issue, and it should not be left just to somehow resolve itself. This could really blow up in everybody's face, and it could become quite dramatic in the worst case scenario.
Thank you. Well, we know today, as I say, Lukashenko has crowned himself despot for an indefinite period until he's removed. So that has been important today. And we're looking forward to seeing what mention there is of Belarus in the statements to be made at the UN General Assembly. I think President Zelensky is due to speak today, the 23rd, and some others. So let's see what messages are sent by representatives of the EU, Washington, and others today, this evening. Ambassador Pieklo, just 2 or 3 words in summing up from you, please.
We are very grateful to Belarusians, to the people in the streets protesting, for reminding us what does it mean European values, what does it mean democracy. It is not the bank account, the new car, vacations in some attractive place. It's a struggle for having a free choice. And this is a great lesson. I'm afraid that Europe is still in the process of accumulating this knowledge and trying to find a response with some Cyprus problem. But thank you, Belarusians, for showing to Europe what does it mean, freedom and democracy.
Bardzo dziękuję. Thank you, Ambassador. I would like to conclude by thanking our speakers, our guests. They were Nigel Gould-Davis, Anders Aslund, Andreas Umland, and Ambassador Jan Pieklo. I'm Bohdan Nahaylo. This has been an event organized by the British-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce. We hope to do more of these things in the future. Thank you for your interest, and thank you to those who made this a very stimulating discussion. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much on behalf of British-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce, and hope to see you on our live events soon.